I first started learning to almost cheat the system without cheating. I think that there were lots of red flags, and even in report cards and parent-teacher conferences, that just because I guess I was a girl or I was misbehaving, none of the teachers picked up on it.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the Literacy Keys. I'm your host, Tracy Young, and I am here with Alexandran Content. Today, what we want to do is we want to talk a little bit about gender biases that we've seen related to dyslexia. So we'll start with talking about some of the key points that we have seen, and then look at some of the red flags broken out by the different age groups and what we saw actually in Alex, and kind of tie it all up with that. So without further ado, let's get started.
Yeah, so I definitely think this is such a hot topic because there is this myth out there that, boys can be more dyslexic than girls because they just show more symptoms, but that's not necessarily the case. I
Okay,
think
now when did you become first aware that this bias might exist?
I think because I was diagnosed at such an older age that there was so many misconceptions of what dyslexia was and what I was told that dyslexia was. And that's just because of, different biases. Sometimes, unfortunately, boys do get diagnosed more often than girls. It doesn't just, happen with dyslexia because all dyslexic cases are different, but it also happens and you can see it in ADHD, ADD, and a lot of other learning disabilities out there. And so I think that's why I was really interested in the subject matter.
All right, so let's break it down a little bit and talk about. There were three elements that you wanted to talk about. So the first is behavioral, right? And we'll get to that. The second is biases that may even be subconscious in the educational system. And the third being kind of some research and whether it exists for the different genders, or perhaps there's a need for it. So let's start with the first one. So you had mentioned behavioral issues. So talk to me a little bit about what you observed and your experiences.
Yeah, for sure. So, in my experience, I think I was the little princess kindergartner going up. I mean, I definitely used my cuteness for me, but I never acted out in class. That was something that I would always be placed next to the boys that were acting out because I was always told that a calm presence, per se, could always help them calm down. And so for me, it was just, very um amusing to a certain extent. And I'm not sure my presence calmed them at the end of the day or whether I was nagging them on. Um, but I thought that was really interesting that, these were students, not colleagues, but classmates of mine that would just act out while even though being dyslexic, I just wouldn't act out. If I had problems, reading the word or not understanding something, I would just simply brush it off and just move on to the next. I would make a fit.
Interesting. So when you're thinking about this, what grade are you referring to?
Oh, for sure. It started, at least from what I remember, it started in second grade.
Okay, because I was thinking first or second grade is
Definitely first or second grade. For sure, second grade. I think that's where it really stood out for me.
okay.
And
And
I remember it because, we were in classes of 25. How we were mixed was it wasn't only second graders all together, but it was also first graders and second graders together in the classroom. And I remember that we would have assigned seatings and it would like change, but there were two boys that I was consistently seated next to. And it was because they were always acting out. And to this day, I do believe that, they definitely had a diagnosis.
or they needed a diagnosis, that they
Exactly.
had a condition, right?
And because of that, I mean, that's something that it started appearing more and more frequently. And then we moved on to third and fourth grade. And surprisingly, one of the two was still in my class. And again, same thing, same behavior notice that all of a sudden, some of the girls with more calming presences were always being seated next to um, some of the boys that would be acting out. And it
Okay.
was really interesting.
So let's step back because I think for our listeners and our viewers, it's important to understand. So you went to elementary school in a small town. So your class may have felt like 25, but it was probably closer to 18. I volunteered and in the class, both first grade, second grade, third grade. So I was in there once a week and know exactly what you're referring to.
Yeah.
What other key points? The other thing that you mentioned is the class was mixed because at the time what the school was doing was they would take and do dual grades. So you would start in the first grade and then you would stay with the same teacher in the second grade, and then they would bring in a new class in the first grade. So it was only then in the third grade that you moved on to a new teacher. And again, they had 3, 4 was combined. So you would have a teacher, you would have the same teacher for 2 years. And I think that part of the reason for that is when it worked well, then it would help improve continuity and learning because, especially at the beginning of the year, you wouldn't have a learning curve. You wouldn't have the 6 weeks that it would take to get used to the teacher. It could be straighter, more continuous learning. So I just wanted to provide that background because I think that's really important to understand and to put it into context. So you were the well behaved child, student, whatever we want to call it. And yet the teachers never picked up that you had issues.
No, absolutely. I mean, it came down to I was someone who wanted to mask my problems. And I think it's very common that you do see it in girls that, when they are having problems or struggling or going through something, they do try and mask their difficulties just to sort of go by and to, drive on by and,
Kind of fly
not to make problems. Exactly. Fly under the radar.
for that. So now again, we are generalizing. And I really want to emphasize that every child is unique and that some of the things that we are seeing may not apply to other students. But if you look at these are your experiences and these are some of the situations that you saw.
No, absolutely. I think the biggest thing about like this myth that like boys are more dyslexic than girls that came out is truly through my own eyes. It's through my own experiences. It's through advocating and talking with others that I really, have come across to feel this way. And I wanted to address it today. And so that's where, there are behavioral differences, at least that I've noticed. And in my case, there was. So I thought it was interesting to point them out.
So, one of the things that we would encourage teachers, or maybe one of the ways that we can help to help to limit this bias is really through education so that teachers are aware of some of the symptoms and red flags, particularly at different age groups, in order to help make them aware of these are actually red flags or potential red flags for dyslexia. So, very valid. Now, the other thing that you wanted to talk about a little bit is, and in fact, that's a perfect segue for biases in teachers. Um, so, why don't you share some of your experiences? And maybe why don't we go to 3, 4, because you were showing some red flags and yet none of us picked up on it.
Well, I think there, sometimes is an issue with first of all, again, I was definitely hiding everything that I could hide. I was trying to fly under the radar to, pass the class, to keep going. And I think a lot of the time with girls, they'll just use their cuteness, especially at that age when you're like, I believe third grade is what, 8 years old?
Second grade is 8, so third grade is 9.
So you're 9 years old, you never want to be pointed out as like having a problem or anything like that. So you just, at least in my experience, I just used my cuteness and I batted my eyes and I said hello. And so that's where, I first started learning to almost cheat the system without cheating. And I think that there were lots of red flags, as you were saying, even in report cards and parent teacher conferences, that just because, um, I guess I was a girl, or I wasn't misbehaving, or I would use my cuteness, none of the teachers picked up on. And I think that, you know, at a certain point, someone should have said something, or because there were red flags, um, it should have been stated. I mean, something that's notorious is I was extremely disorganized. And little behold, there is a correlation between, or I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, disorganization and dyslexia. I mean, I was so disorganized to the point where at the end of the year, we all got, the little awards for quirky behaviors, fun things throughout the year. And my award was messiest year. And then the second year, I had messiest desk the first year. And then the second year, I had again messiest desk 2 years in a row. And so that was just like to really prove the point of like, I definitely had an organizational problem, but it was just never addressed because at the end of the day, it just flowed under the radar and it was seen as, oh, that's just Alex's personality.
Right. And I think one of the things also is that when a teacher is managing a classroom full of students, and let's say we were up to 20 students at this point in the classroom, then the students that are behaving who appear to be learning, right, then the teacher just isn't going to focus as much on them. There's a limited number of hours, and they are going to focus on perhaps the disruptive child that is impeding learning for all of the other 19 students.
Absolutely. And I still believe, to this day, there definitely is, to a certain extent, as long as the child is learning, let's just push them across the finish line instead of like stepping back and saying, I thought the potential of this student was a bit higher. I'm surprised they're scoring lower on things that I would expect them to be scoring a little bit higher on. So I feel like there's definitely a move the masses. And that really just like shows the point that it could be a lack of education back then. Nowadays I really do think that there is more education on this topic. Um, but it also I think just shows is that at what point is it a problem?
And that actually gets into the issue of FAPE, right? Free and public education, or free and appropriate education. Um, it is not the school's duty to ensure that every child reaches their potential. That is not the definition of public school. It never has been. And anyone that tells you otherwise really doesn't know the law for that. You're not required, school is not required to provide a student with a Bentley if they'll provide a Ford.
Yeah, and I think that's something super interesting because, you know, especially parents looking back, they're like, you want the best. You want to push your kid in order to achieve the most. And so, you definitely can run into a little bit of friction, or you already do believe this. You do believe that your child is being pushed the most, is, receiving the best quality. And that's also a lot of the times where gaps do go or things do get pushed under the rug to a certain extent because of what you said. I think you referred to it as FAPE. I've never heard of it.
FAPE, write it down. Very well known.
And so I think with that, because schools aren't um they don't need to push each student to their max potential. I mean, of course, some teachers really do it because they really do believe in the education system. But at the end of the day, when you have over 200 students that, you're grading and quizzing, it just becomes incapable. It's just, there's not enough hours in the day. But what I do see is that, you know, sometimes it also shows the importance of, meeting with the teacher, understanding, like, is there anything wrong? And I totally understand it that, when teachers do miss this, also the parents could totally miss it as well. Because, if a teacher says you're fine, like your kid's doing great, why am I going to second guess that?
Well, I think that it's a partnership between the teacher, the school, and the parent. And one of the things that parents are like, we're not experts. We're looking for this to the schools to tell us how our child is doing. Are they performing where they need to be performing, and everything else? Now, unfortunately, if you look at the education, so the universities that prepare teachers, there are two areas really that I don't want to say criticize, but I would say there is an absolute deficit in. So the first one being that they are not taught how to teach reading. So, teacher prep courses, I had heard someone say something like 8 hours of instruction. That's all they get. Now, don't quote me on those 8 hours, but in a 2 year master's program or even a 1 year master's program, to get 8 hours to know how to teach reading to children, which honestly is kind of a big deal. It's one of the primary purposes of school, but that's my opinion. Is so going back 8 hours is insufficient. There's been a lot of advocacy work around trying to change the curriculum for teacher preparation universities, recognizing that this is a deficit and what can be done. But as with any institution, it'll probably take 30 years to make those changes, at least from my observation in the state that we live. The other thing is that parents and individual teachers not knowing the signs of what to look for, shall we say. And so we will get to what are some of the signs that we should look for in a few minutes. I think one of the other things, though, before we go directly to the signs, that you had wanted to talk about was research or perhaps lack of research. So I'm going to turn it back over to you if you could share your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. So when we decided to cover this topic, I mean, it's something that um it's an important matter to me because it is a very personal topic because I was diagnosed so late in my childhood, and I was diagnosed as a teenager. And there really is, in my opinion, a lack of testing. And there are even, to a certain extent, research gaps that in the pools that people are researching, it tends to be more fixated and focused on boys rather than girls, just exacerbating the problem.
Okay. And so, how tie that back to research? Okay, loop it together for me because
So,
I'm not connecting the dots yet.
no, so it goes to a certain extent. We're here and we're advocating and we're saying these are all, the symptoms, and, this is the curve of dyslexia. But I think a lot of the time, because, dyslexia really is it's a very big spectrum. And there isn't one diagnosis for every single person. But I also feel often that because of this research bias, that a lot of the time some of the girls are just not being diagnosed properly because they're not showing the exact same symptoms that have been tested on the majority of boys.
So, what you're saying, if I hear you correctly, is like, let's take it back to elementary school. So, if a child Let's start there. If a child is misbehaving in the classroom, right, continuously and disrupting learning for everyone, then there is a higher probability that that child, at least in the public school system, is going to be referred for an evaluation, whether that ends up being just a behavioral plan or an actual IEP. In that sense, I would agree with you 100% because I think that that is something. Let's face it, there are limited resources, teachers, schools, and everything else. So you're almost going to do a triage in which you're going to take the 80/20 rule. If I can solve 80% of the issues by focusing on 20% of these students, then that's what's going to be done. And so little Mary, who is behaving and doesn't fall into that 20% that's causing all of the problems, they're just going to be ignored.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think you really summarized it much better than I could have. So thank you for that. It could be, the 23 years of knowing me.
Absolutely. And kind of some of the quirks that we've seen, which is a perfect segue to talk about why don't we take a few minutes? Because part of our goal in starting the podcast and having different episodes is really to increase awareness so that people, first of all, know what dyslexia is, that it does exist, and then start to educate themselves and become aware of what some of the red flags are so that they don't just chalk it up to, oh, well, that's Alex, to personality quirks and things like that, that truly there might be an underlying situation. So, what I did was I took and printed out. I have actually on the website, there is a dyslexia red flags. It's a PDF that is available to anyone for free. So I printed that out and we can go through some of the different points. It's divided by age group and you can share, oh yeah, that makes sense for me and so forth. And then we could almost say, wow, why weren't you evaluated earlier for
Yeah,
that?
absolutely. So I think as you read it, the list, then I'll say yes or no. And if it's a yes, then maybe there's like a story that I can remember behind it that I could
Okay.
also share with the listeners. Because I think it's also really interesting to understand, yes, I had that, but how did it show? How did it manifest in my life?
Absolutely. And I think that it's through the stories really that we connect with other parents and maybe even some individuals themselves. I mean, I can't tell you how many times people that I've encountered say, "Oh, I was reading up on it, and guess what? I think I'm dyslexic," things like that. So, what I've done is I've taken and broken it down into early childhood, which is up to age 4, primary school, which is age between the ages of 5 and 12, and then teenage years. All right. So let's start with the early childhood. So this is basically before they get into kindergarten. Right. Nowadays with pre-K, I don't want to go into the minutia, but these are some just broad strokes. So first is relatives with dyslexia.
Yes. See, now this one I think was, brushed underneath because no one in our family was diagnosed with dyslexia. Yet there is a lot of speculation now that we are much more aware and educated on the topic of dyslexia that we can say, I think Nana had dyslexia.
Right. And also, I think that her father was dyslexic because he only went to the second grade. Okay. So, relatives with dyslexia, whether people are aware or not of it, inability to rhyme, that's another. Now, let me step back for a second because
This is
these
a hard one.
hold on. These are warning signs. You can't just say, oh, I have an inability to rhyme. I'm dyslexic. No, 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 no. That's not how this works. This checklist is to say, these might be red flags that taken together think about being evaluated. That's truly how they should be used. Okay. Because one thing in isolation does not a situation make. So, inability to rhyme. So, Alex, what rhymes with hat?
Well, I think that just proves the point that as when I was young, I despised Dr. Seuss
Oh, I
for the
love those
purpose
books.
of that poor cat in the hat. I could not rhyme. And so my sister would make fun of me for it to a certain extent. And from that, I was like, absolutely not. Why am I going to bother reading a book of someone who can do it better than me? And to a certain extent, I was like, ugh. And so I immediately closed off Dr. Seuss because, still to this day, I struggle with rhyming. It takes me minutes, not minutes. I mean, a few seconds to really think of, even an easy word because I need to go alphabetically. So if you say cow, I'm going to go ow, bow, cow, dow.
Foul,
Yeah.
which is not a word. How?
Bow, how. Eventually to get to how, which is just so ridiculous that I'm just like, absolutely not. Why am I going to subject myself to this torture, to this pain? So, yes, rhyming for sure was like a big tick mark for me. And
Okay.
I don't know if you remember this, but in fifth grade, we had a musical.
Yes. Oh,
And it
and you
was,
got braces. I remember
and I had
it.
braces, yes. And it was on tongue twisters and rhyming. And I loved musicals. But when we had to do the cold reading and we had to do, and I mean, the cold reading was something that just like terrified me all throughout. I'm sure we'll hear more about that symptom later. Um, when we had to go through that, I remember I was terrified and I despised it. Oh,
There we go. Okay, absolutely. For that. Okay, so
rhyming's
issues
out.
with rhyming. Confusion between left and right.
I think still to this day, I have to go like this. I look at my hands, I make the little L's shapes. And then the problem is that I have to really think about it for a second and say, okay, well, both of them look like L's. So which
Okay.
one is it? And what I have done, which was what worked for me, is that I've known that I am right handed. So what I do is I just imagine myself quickly picking up a pencil, which one feels more natural. And I literally make the gesture like I'm holding a pen. And that's how I know my left and rights. And I can say doing that while driving a car is not easy. It takes a moment.
Right, exactly. So better to tell you if we're going to be turning left, at
Yes.
least a minute in advance and then point.
Oh my God, absolutely. I definitely say to people when they're giving me navigation support or advice, please point in the direction because if you say left or right, that is not going to help me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so confusion for left and right. Um, inability to find the right word.
Yeah, that's happened to me multiple times throughout this podcast right now.
Okay, there we go. So why don't we? I was looking at that and I moved it into the primary because I think that you had an instance that really was a little bit older in that 5 to 12 age group. So, why don't we talk about that one? And then that will segue us into the primary, the next category, shall we say?
Well, I think inability to find the right word, something that I would do, and now reflecting on it, I actually did it more frequently, is I always would forget, the word never mind or I forgot and stuff like that. So, when I would say, Mom, Dad, blah, 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 and they'd be like, What was that, Alex? Or like, tell me more. I would just say, I love you. And then I just walk away because I would forget and it would be like kind of like embarrassing. So I just like, I love you and then walk away.
Okay. And that's funny because I don't remember, but I don't read your mind. So it was just Alex being, oh, that's so cute. She just came to tell me she loved me.
Exactly. And and that's again, that's how I use my cuteness To the advantage. You would just think I'm coming downstairs to tell you I love you instead of me being like, shoot, what's that word? I forgot. Oh my God, I love you.
Okay, excellent. Right.
Yeah. Uh,
So this next group, so that's kind of borderline. I mean, that probably started when you were around 4 or so, and then continued when you were a little older. Right. So that could be in either. So, really taking a look at the group of primary school years. So, between the ages of, say, 5 and 12, grouping those together. So, for example, decoding issues.
so, because I didn't know what dyslexia was, nor what decoding was, I would say that I guessed words and I never learned how to decode words. And just through pure, I guess, like synthesis, I would be able to guess the word. I mean, if I'm understanding 80% of the sentence, I can guess.
You right, except it really impacts comprehension until you get to 97, 98%.
Right, right, right. Which again, symptom, under the carpet, red flag, the whole point of this. But absolutely, I was a guesser. I wasn't a decoder. I never learned what decoding was or how to use it because my mind is just wired differently.
Right, right. And one of the great ways of kind of assessing whether people can break apart and decode a word is to use nonsense words. The words that actually don't exist. And you are only able to pronounce it or spell it by using the rules of English. So that's one thing, which kind of ties beautifully into poor spelling and not being able to spell because you don't know the rules. How about
Absolutely. Wait, hold on. I just want to say something quickly. I think my favorite to that one would be I despised it, and I still to this day despise it. When people tell me to sound out the word,
okay?
because that doesn't help. I could sound it out in so many different ways. I mean, of course you have to think like everyone's accent is different. So how you pronounce a word is very different than maybe how I would pronounce a word. So I'm going to spell it how I pronounce it. And there are so many rules in English that you don't spell things how you pronounce it.
Right. So that was really bad
Yeah.
advice, I would say. What about trouble memorizing information?
I think so. I definitely learned how to deal with memorizing information. And, I learned like different they're called acronyms, right? I'm not pulling the wrong word.
Mnemonics. Nu-
Mnemonics to use,
Mnemonics. Yeah.
Um, but definitely, especially when I'd have to remember, I think, um, more of a timeline of information. I learned that I had to like write it out. I had to visualize it. I had to like put it in like flow boxes in order to actually like retain that information. Um, but absolutely. But I don't think it was to big extent. Now, if you go back and you look at my diagnosis results, you probably would say, Alex, I beg to differ. But at the end of the day, how many times in your life does someone say, remember, apple, banana, house, car, blah, 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 blah. And instead, it's to that point of if you never do it often, you
Right.
never realize it.
Right. And I would say that when I tutor, a lot of times I'm creating mnemonics. So for one student that we were trying to, I was helping him with math because he has dyscalculia. And we created a mnemonic for, let's see, Dear Molly sells bagels. And for him to remember that for dear, division, Molly, multiplication, then cells, subtract, and bring down. Right. So they would the order of what you do with long division in order to remember the steps. So that is something that can be very helpful. So let's just talk about one more item for that age group before we go on to the next one. So sometimes we see at this age group that children begin to dislike school. Now, that never really happened for you. So, do you want to talk a little bit about it? Let me step back for a second before you start talking about it. What I mean is that children will start to develop stomach aches and other items so that they just don't want to go into school because it's too hard and it's miserable for them. So, talk a little bit about your experience because that was different.
Right. And I think something that could tie into again was because I was so good at flying below the radar. I mean, I never necessarily felt stupid in class. I felt like I had to work harder, but not necessarily stupid. And I feel like a lot of the times is when you start to feel stupid, especially at such a young age, you start to build low confidence, unfortunately. And then, with this low confidence, it does end in form into sometimes anxiety, low self-esteem, um feeling stupid. And I think that really does affect you, and that's why I think another issue, or not issue, but a reason why I didn't necessarily have this symptom is because I viewed school as an amazing communication
Oh,
spot.
there was a social aspect, and you're
Well,
a social butterfly. Talk
A
about
hundred
that.
percent. So I think when you're an extrovert in a family filled with introverts, you eventually, you love school in the sense that you can sit at lunch and talk to your friends who are just like you all day, or I would do a bunch of other things. So I don't think I was ever demotivated in the sense that brought on not enjoying school or low confidence.
Okay. All right. That's fair. So now let's quickly segue to teenage years. So 13 plus, right? There, you're still seeing some of similar situations, similar symptoms, shall we say? That slow reading, inability to spell, the it may be more acute because perhaps your peers are able to read faster. Fluency can become more obvious sometimes, as well as you're required to spell bigger words, more complex words, and so forth. The Here's one. Struggles with secondary language because a lot of times in late middle school to high school, students will be required to take a second language. Talk to me about your experience with the second language.
So I actually wanted to backtrack for a second because you said something interesting. That all of a sudden you're going to be, falling behind your peers. And I think that's actually where you're going to start to see more of this lower confidence, not enjoying school, not wanting to go to school, skipping. Even that's where, like, maybe more of your behavioral problems or issues are going to come out, and more of a rebellious term rather than, this could be because of a learning disability. Um, and then going back to languages, um, I love languages in the sense that I love listening to languages, and that's how I really would learn a language in the sense. I mean, not that I know lots of languages, but I remember in high school we were doing Spanish, and the teachers that we had only catered to one kind of learning, and it was the textbook learning. You open a textbook, you read the grammar rules, you write down the word, and at the end of the week there's an exam. And, if you made, I remember it vividly because it would be something that would get my knickers in a twist, if that's even the right expression,
Hmm.
would be that every single time I would just misspell one word, it was like -5 points. So at the end of the day, because, even if you get the accent on the wrong thing or on the wrong letter, it's -5 points. So I would be studying, trying to recall and remember these words, and it's the first time you're ever trying to learn something, and really you're learning how to study, which of course I did not master yet. And I just felt so unmotivated. And I brought up, hey, I'm kind of struggling, and there was nothing done around the topic. I mean, it was the same thing, and it was like, well, this is the way we learn. And you look at your classmates, and it was a very strict teacher as well. And you look at your classmates, and some of them are flourishing, but also others are not necessarily flourishing. And you're just like, well, I'm not even flourishing a little bit. I'm so far behind. I don't understand anything. Like, what the heck? And it's because it was very much old textbook learning instead of, using your senses, always like hearing the language. It was very much, let's learn this new language based off a textbook. And I'm sorry to say, but I also had zero rule, like knew nothing about grammar. So now I need to learn grammar first in order to apply grammar to another language. And I was like, this is ridiculous. This is way too much work. And I just tried to fly by under the radar, and my grades did suffer.
Right. In fact, it's interesting because I remember Spanish being your lowest grade. And I saw that you were struggling and kind of bent one of my rules that, well, do your best and just get through this course. It's less about the grade. And because I saw that you were struggling with it, I don't know if you remember, you came and you had a respectable grade. I mean, I think that you ended up with maybe a B or something like that. But compared to your other grades, this was your lowest grade. And I saw that you were putting the effort in. I saw that you were doing it. But I also remember that the spelling and the accents were tripping you up for
Mhm.
that. So that's
I felt like it was no matter how much I looked at it, I was just, maybe it's decoding, maybe it's something. I was never able to understand how to spell it. And it's something so interesting because at the end of the day, when someone was like speaking, it was more conversational. I didn't have necessarily a problem there, but it really came down to how to construct a phrase, where to put the accent, how to spell words, that I was like, oh my gosh, I'm on a whole other planet here.
right. And I think that one of the ways that we solved it is we sent you on an exchange program. And was it Valladolid? Or,
Yeah, I
okay,
went to
where
Valladolid.
you went for a couple of weeks over the summer and
Yeah,
in a
and
program.
I remember that the next or the following 2 years afterwards, the school had signed me up to the same Spanish teacher. And I remember saying, no, I'm going to go for the different Spanish teacher in the harder class because I remember she had a completely different method of teaching, that it was very much conversational, very much immersion teaching, that I was like, oh, I'm going to relate to this. I truly believe that I will learn better.
Right, absolutely. So, struggling with the second language is one of the things that you sometimes see in high school. Now, as a requirement, what many dyslexics will do is take American Sign Language, ASL, as a language requirement. So, I want to just offer that as a tip to our listeners to explore if their child is really unable or is struggling with that second language, consider looking into ASL. That is fully accepted um, as meeting the language requirement. Let me see if there's anything else. Really, you talked a little bit about the cold reading and so forth.
Yeah,
I'll just let me just quickly. I'll go teenage years, you're seeing a lot of the same conditions. So, slow reading, difficulty spelling, struggles with the second language, limited vocabulary, um, stilted oral reading, and cold readings.
so, can I just make two comments here quickly before
Hmm.
wrapping up? I think there also should be a difference between, when we say like limited vocabulary, sometimes the student can come across as having a larger vocabulary than their spelling vocabulary or their comprehension vocabulary. And I do think that's something important to notice because I do believe, and now you can correct this if I'm wrong, that I definitely had a larger vocabulary when it came to speech rather than reading and writing. And I think that
Hmm.
also reflected in my essays, that sometimes my essays um were almost below grade level in the terminology that I would use.
Very fair, absolutely. Now, one of the things that I remember, one of the markers when you were evaluated, you scored at 2% for vocabulary. So 98% of your peers had a stronger vocabulary than you did.
Ouch, did not remember that.
Oh, I
I was
remember
like
that one.
blocked out. Interesting. In like written or speech?
See, that's what I'm not sure because I'm not a neuropsychologist. I didn't assess you. I just remember one of the subtests was vocabulary, and there's a score on it, and you scored 2%. I'm like, okay.
Well, breaking the barriers, guys. Love it. That's where it's important. Know your strengths and work with your strengths. Um, the other thing that I wanted to say was cold reading.
Okay.
Horrible, horrific. We would be in class and we would have to go one by one and read. And when we were doing that, I would count how many people were ahead of me, flip to that page and practice reading it in my head multiple times, completely missing what everyone else is saying. I was like, I'll figure out a way. And I would do that. And I remember as I got older, sometimes for popcorn reading, my friends, if they wanted to waste time in the class, they would just call on me. And then I would struggle through the paragraph, which would take me a ridiculous amount of time and we would waste a lot of time. And to a certain extent, I'm pretty sure that they thought I was joking around. But at the same time, I was so embarrassed that I wasn't joking around.
Yeah. Because at that age, you realize the difference between your ability and your peers' ability.
Mhm.
Yeah. Very good. So, advice that you have, really going back to some of the biases that girls don't have dyslexia at the rates that boys do.
Yeah, I think my biggest advice, maybe it's for parents and for educators, anyone listening, I think is to judge and look at performance, not necessarily behavior, if that makes sense.
Right.
And understand that dyslexia is a spectrum and no two cases are the same. So
Okay.
dyslexia can come out in multiple different forms.
Okay. Absolutely. Wonderful. And I will leave us with, for the listeners, that the PDF that we referenced and used to kind of guide us along with some of the symptoms that you see at the different age groups is available on the Literacy Keys website. And I will provide a link in the show notes. So, with that, I think this is a wrap. And I want to thank everyone for listening. Bye now.
Bye bye.